Just a brief history of our Buchanan ancestors. All Buchanans in the world can presumably trace their family name back to Buchanan Parish, Buchanan area on the east shore of Loch Lomond, including Ben Lomond, the mountain. And this is located just north of Glasgow in Scotland, in the Trossachs area. In the 1600s, a lot of Scots were brought into Ireland. The reasons were many. Some of the Scottish earls or Irish earls had rebelled against the crown, and they had their lands confiscated, and this land was given to English and Scottish nobles instead. And note that at this time, basically the only people that were entitled to own land were part of the landed aristocracy. Our Buchanans lived in Northern Ireland in County Tyrone. County Tyrone is fairly easy to find in that the biggest lake in Northern Ireland is in County Tyrone. West of that lake, Loch Ness, there is the capital town of Omagh, and our ancestors lived near Castledurg. Their three oldest children were christened, or three of their oldest children were christened in the Castledurg church there, which was the Church of Ireland. And however, at the time that they were planning to move to Canada, they lived in an area, a townland, as they call them there, which is a small rural district, a townland called Binnawooda. And here we see the town of Drumquin, which is fairly close. Killatur and Killen are over here in this area. There's Castledurg further north. And anyways, this was the land where the place where they lived at the time that their son William got married. This was where they lived at the time that they left for Canada. And you know, the lower right corner of Binnawooda townland extends into Loch Lee, which is this little lake down here. And you'll see an arrow there indicating that this is a high point. And this is called Bin Mountain. And here's a map of what the townland looks like a little bit more closely. And it's most easily found in Google Maps or Google Earth by looking for Bin Mountain Wind Farm, because these days along this line here is a row of wind turbines. Okay, let's switch to a different view. Here is a historical map of the area. Again, there's Loch Lee down there, with just the corner of Binnawooda sticking into the lake. And as we follow this dark red outline here, this is the border of Binnawooda townland. And you'll notice one thing here, that all of these farms, these little acreages, are on the northern half of the map. When you get down into the southern half of the map, it's basically blank, because that is the mountain, and the land is not cultivable for the most part. So specifically, which of these parcels of land Andrew Buchanan farmed, we don't know, because the earliest records we've got, they're that specific date to 1859, which is 12 years after the Buchanans had left for Canada. Here we can see some views of what the countryside is like. This is Hard Barn Road, Binnawooda. And here is another view of the countryside there. Bin Mountain up at the top. And then of course it drops off below. And here is a cottage, probably bigger and fancier than the ones that most people lived in at the time. My impression is that most families at that time had smaller and humbler homes than that. And here we have Binnawooda Spring. Not a particularly good picture of it, but anyways, I believe that's where the Fairy Water Creek begins, which is another of the geographical features of the area. Okay, what about Binnawooda? If we do a search on askaboutirland.ie, you'll see that Binnawooda is one of the places that's mentioned. And we can look at the list of occupants. Okay, and you can see that in that northern half of Binnawooda, which measures maybe a kilometer, less than a kilometer wide, and maybe a couple of kilometers north to south, you had all of these families living in 1859. And we can get the details. We'll go with Robert Sproul. There is a Sproul connection to Buchanan's. And okay, he is the tenant. He's a tenant farmer. His landlord is Robert Monteith, who in turn is a tenant of the Honorable A.G. Stewart, I believe. And anyways, a little bit of information there. It's County Tyrone. The barony is called Omagh West. The Poor Law Union is Castleburg. The parish is Ardstraw. Now this is the Church of Ireland parish, Presbyterian, and other denominations would have different boundaries. The townland is Binnawooda. And it gives a little bit more information here about Robert Sproul's position on the page. It says it's 26, printing date 1859. Okay, so that's just a little bit more information there. And here we can bring up the map, like the historical map that I showed. Actually, one thing that's kind of interesting on that historical map, let's just get back there very quickly, is this slider here, where it is set to the historical view. And as we move the slider over to the modern view, you'll see that the townlands are no longer shown on the modern map. We'll go back a little bit. They're still showing there, but not quite as prominent. They're not apparently as big a thing these days as what they were back then. Okay, let's move along here. Okay, 1847. The family decided to leave Ireland. This was during the darkest time of the Great Irish Famine. And a lot of families were leaving Ireland at that time. In fact, 1 million people, it's estimated, left Ireland 1 million people starved to death, chiefly in the western part of Ireland. So out of a population of 5 million, 2 million were gone by the end of that 6-year period. Okay, so going from Binnawooda, they would have followed approximately this route. This is the modern road, of course. And they went north to the seaport of Londonderry, where they had passage on a wooden sailing ship. That's the kind like the pirate ships you see in the movies with sails and so forth. And they left for Canada. And, different map, they were out to sea about 10 days when they ran into a severe North Atlantic storm, and the ship was battered so badly that they had to return for repairs before trying a second time. On the second time, they made it to Canada, but an outbreak of what they called immigrant fever, what we would today call typhus fever or cholera, had broken out. When they reached the Canadian, or British actually, since this was British Canada, or British America, the quarantine station at Gros Isle, it is said that there were 200 ships lined up waiting to get into the quarantine station. So their shipload of people were sent up the St. Lawrence to Kingston, which was I guess a small town at the time. It had been the capital of Canada East. But anyways, there they were cared for by local people at great risk to their own lives. And there, the father, Andrew, died of the fever, and his son, William's baby daughter, also died of the fever and were buried there at Kingston. After they were allowed out of quarantine, they came west to Escasing, where the men worked in the harvest to make a little bit of money. Now, the family had paid for their own fare. This is something they were very proud of. Many people had come to Canada at government expense, but not the Buchanans. They apparently paid their own way. From Escasing, they came to Northeast Hope, where they had Irish friends. And then they looked for a place to live. Now, unlike Ireland, where all of the land was tied up by large landowners, here in the wilds of Canada, there were vast tracts of land that were open. Anybody could move in and set up a farm there. This area was called the Queen's Bush. It was Queen Victoria's day, after all. And the bush belonged to the Crown. And about 30 kilometers north of Stratford, Ontario, they found farmland in a huge forest of great trees, an area that they called Donegal. Well, neighbors called it Buchananville at first because of all these Buchanans that were settling there. After all, Andrew and Jane had 7 sons and a daughter who married James Watson Jr. And they all lived around Donegal. Now, in 1879, by this time, a new generation was looking for places to farm, and land in Ontario was very expensive. And there was free land to be held in Manitoba because the new government of Canada had purchased Rupert's Land, from the Hudson's Bay Company. Now, Rupert's land included, most of Manitoba, most of Saskatchewan, most of Alberta, parts of British Columbia, and into the Northwest Territories. So it was a big thing. And the government of Canada wanted Canadian settlers to settle in this area to, I guess, further strengthen their claims to the area, because they were aware that in the United States, there were people who were saying 54-40 or fight. This is where we think the border between Canada and the United States should be. And so they packed up everything at Donegal, loaded onto the train, including their livestock and so forth. I don't know the exact route, but this is probably fairly close to it. At Winnipeg, they had to get off the train because that was the end of the tracks. That was the end of the railroad at that point. And then ferry their goods, their belongings across the river to the other side. And then with wagons, they were able to continue to the area where Neepawa, Manitoba, would later be built. Well, not much later, but and of course, Neepawa was founded by the brother-in-law of Jane Buchanan, who married John James Hamilton, who was his brother, and another man that had established the location of Neepawa, Manitoba. Oh, okay. You notice there's also a line there going to Gold Hill, Nevada, because in the 1870 time period, I think it was, the men found that they could, during the winter time when there wasn't much farming to be done, they could try and find work for $1 a day if they were lucky in Ontario, or they could get a job for $3 a day working in the huge underground gold and silver mines in Nevada, which was a big thing at the time. So some years during the wintertime, they would make the 11-day journey from Donegal to Gold Hill and work in the mines for the winter. And then in the spring, they would go back to put in the crops and so forth. Okay, so 1879, they made the trip to Neepawa. My grandfather, William Andrew Buchanan, was born in Listowel, Ontario, but grew up in the Neepawa area, and he owned a couple of blacksmith shops in that area, one in Riding Mountain, I think another in Burnie, and a bigger one in Neepawa. So he was a successful businessman, and he was single. And one day the Watson family arrived in town to visit with some relatives, and he was smitten. Elizabeth Jane Watson. So when the Watsons moved on to join the father of that family, George Watson at Millet, Alberta, William Andrew Buchanan sold his blacksmith shops and came west to Millet, and there in 1905, he and Elizabeth were married in Edmonton, Northwest Territories, because it was still not the Northwest Territories for a few more weeks. Since Alberta and Saskatchewan were not formed yet. My dad was born at Neepawa, and although he thought he was born in Riding Mountain, since that's where his parents were living at the time he was born. But in 1962, I went to Nipoa looking for family history information. I was a new convert and eager to get started with my family history. And one of the people I visited there was Isabella Hunter, a first cousin to my dad's. I knocked on her door, and when she answered, I said, "Hi, I'm Bill Buchanan. My dad, William George Buchanan, was born at Riding Mountain. His parents were William Andrew Buchanan, the blacksmith, and Elizabeth Jane Watson." She said, "Your daddy wasn't born in Riding Mountain. He was born on my parents' farm here at Nipoa. I was there when he was born." I thought, oh, that's wonderful news, because he's been trying to get a birth certificate. His birth was never registered at the time that he was born. And he was told that if someone who was present could swear an affidavit, that he'd be able to get his birth certificate. She said, "Oh, I'd be happy to do that." So we had a good visit, visited various other people there. Found out a lot of information about the John Buchanan family, which was my great-grandfather, his brother Sam, and Sam's family, and their sister Jane and her family, and a few others. And anyways, William Andrew Buchanan set up a blacksmith shop in Millet, and they lived there. Well, they moved back to Manitoba, I think once or twice. They had a farm at Leedale, west of Millet, for some time as well. But then they decided to move to Tacoma, Washington. And I've often wondered why that was. It meant giving up his business in Millet and working as a laborer, as I understand it, cleaning streetcars and that sort of thing in Tacoma. I think that they probably moved hoping that living on the coast, that the moisture air would help Elizabeth, who suffered from chronic asthma. And anyways, while they were there, she died. And apparently someone was talking about taking the youngest child, Ines, away and raising her. And Grandpa, or Pa, as he was commonly called by the family and family friends, packed up the family and came back to Millet. And my dad and his brother Jack both got farms west of Breton, 6 or 7 miles west of Breton. And they married, lived in that area for a while. Eventually, my dad's family moved to Edgewater, BC, where I spent my teenage years before coming to Calgary to attend school. And there I met Judy. We were married, and we lived in Calgary for the first few years of our married life before employment took us to Brooks and Grand Cache, Spruce Grove, and the Alberta Beach area. And now we're back in Spruce Grove again. And I think that's probably enough history for one sitting. So I'll sign off.